I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So on behalf of those present, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we now meet. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and hope the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. Just to let you know, we've got a small team that's running the awards for this year. The awards are no longer funded by the Department of Education and Training like they were in the past. They're now funded through Universities Australia. So each university pays a subscription fee to be part of Universities Australia, and Universities Australia just skim a little bit off the top and use that to run the awards. So I've got a small team here. You just met Angeline, who did a little bit of housekeeping. I've also got Jin. Jin's our awards coordinator, making sure that all the coordinating aspects of the Teaching Awards are running smoothly. The purpose today is really to support participants wanting to put together an application for a teaching award. And in the awards, we have awards for citations where applicants have to address one criteria, but with a teaching award, they have to address a number of criteria. We're really fortunate today to have a number of guest presenters. Emeritus Professor Pip Pattison, who you can see on screen. Emeritus Professor Pip Pattison is an esteemed quantitative psychologist and educational leader. She's held numerous educational leadership roles and stewarded educational transformation across Australia's longest standing academic institutions, University of Melbourne, University of Sydney being two of them. She's previously been the DVC Education and is currently Professor Emeritus at University of Sydney. Pip's been involved in the awards for many years now, and last year she took on the role as chair for the Teaching Awards Committee, and we are really pleased and grateful that Pip has accepted the role and will continue in the role of chair as this year. Thank you, Pip. Welcome to today's session. And we also have two Teaching Excellence Award recipients. I'll start off with Dr. Diana Tolmie from Griffith University, and Diana got a Teaching Excellence Award in the category of Creative Art. Diana is recognised as a world-leading pioneer in innovative course design that reforms the education ethos of the original 19th century. So Diana, good to see you here. You have, for over 2 decades, she has dedicated her energies to elevating the status of professional musicians and ensuring graduates possess the right tools and knowledge to adapt and transform an industry and profession that continues to be challenged. So we'll be hearing more from Diana in a little while. And we've got Dr. Bonnie McBain, known Bonnie for quite some time. Doesn't surprise me that Bonnie has got a teaching award. She's from the University of Newcastle, and she was awarded a Teaching Excellence Award in the Natural and Physical Sciences, Agriculture, Environment and Related Studies category. Over the past decade, Bonnie has transformed higher education thinking about design of science and sustainability curricula by co-developing and applying a new participatory approach of curriculum design called collaborative curriculum design. She has enabled science graduates to hone their skills to address wicked problems, for example, climate change. Welcome on board, all three ladies. We're going to start the session off with Pip Pattison, and she's going to talk us through some of the key factors to writing a successful teaching award. So over to you, Pip.
Thanks so much, Ange, and thanks for your lovely introductions to all of us. And thanks everyone for joining us. I'd like to start really by thanking you for the great work that you do. I think everyone on the call is passionate about education, and we're passionate about these awards because we think they serve a really important purpose in recognising excellence in teaching in Australian higher education. And I think that's something that we collectively feel is important. So we really do appreciate your interest in the awards. I'd like to start talking about, what we're looking for. And of course, some of this is already in the course resources. But what the panels are generally looking for is an account of you as an educator. So we really want to understand you, your philosophy, your aspirations, your approach to reflection and learning, and your teaching achievements. And of course, at the same time, address all of the criteria that are important in actually coming up with a valid and reliable assessment of each application. So we want you to tick all the boxes as laid out in the guidelines. So address all of the subcategories that I'll talk about in a moment, and provide evidence against each of the assessment criteria in relation to each of the subcategories. There's quite a lot to cover, but to do it in a way that really captures the essence of you as a teacher. And of course, we're also looking for a level of sustained commitment and excellence. That, you can understand, is it's not an easy ask, and we recognise that writing a good application does actually take time. So my sort of first advice is really to get started quite early, and ideally to begin with a very open period of reflection on what you've achieved and how you've gone about it and why you've gone about it. Many of the successful applicants talk about the value of this, and so I really think, to the extent that you can sort of take the time to do that, I think it will be helpful. And indeed, many also talk about the fact that it's useful in its own right, not just for preparing for the award, but also as part of the regular cycle of reflection and feedback that makes a good teacher. So we hope that you'll be able to use the work that you do on the application for other purposes, whether it's to come up with new ideas for your future teaching, prepare a promotion application, prepare something that might be useful for another opportunity, for example, these awards or other awards in future, or indeed for your own scholarly contributions. We really see this as something that may be helpful and valuable in its own right. The other thing I wanted to say about this was it's really good to start early, because you will then have the time to get feedback from your colleagues and from your institutional experts. And I know a number of the institutional contact officers, or ICOs as they're called, are joining us today. Please know just how much everyone wants to help you get your application up, because they all care about good teaching and they're really keen to help. So please don't hold back in getting feedback from your colleagues. The other thing I should say, of course, is, and many of you will have already done this, there is, of course, value in getting experience and enjoying some success in the internal award programs in your own university, whether it's at the faculty or broader university level. So that, of course, will help you know how to go about this next application. As you know, I'm sure you need to select a discipline category. These were changed in recent years to align with the ASCED codes, but hopefully the choice will not be a difficult one. But if you do have any questions about which category to choose, please do use your ICO as a source of advice. You can also choose to nominate in the early career category if you meet the criterion for that, which is that you're within your first 5 years of teaching. And you might also be eligible for the Neville Bonner Award for Indigenous Education. If that's of interest to you, again, I'd very much encourage you to connect with your ICO, and indeed also with your PVC or DVC Indigenous. In fact, you probably will have already, given that there's an extra supportive step in the process for those awards. We offer up to 9 awards. Generally, the idea is to have one in each category, but we will vary that a little bit from year to year, depending on where the best applications are. And of course, we then select one person for Australian University Teacher of the Year, or one application for that very prestigious award of Australian University Teacher. As you all know, because you're good at it and you engage in it on a regular basis, teaching is a complex process. And so in order to structure the description of what you do and how you go about it, we ask you to address 4 of the different subdomains of the sort of teaching process, and you can see them listed here on this slide: approaches to teaching and or the supportive learning that influence, motivate and inspire students to learn, development of curricular resources or services, effective assessment strategies, and innovation or leadership in teaching. And we ask that, as I say, you address all of them, and each application will be praised in relation to each of those categories. So it is important that you don't leave any out, even if your strengths lie in a subset of these things. These are the assessment criteria. And so what we want you to do is to provide some evidence in relation to each of these criteria for each of the 4 subcategories. As I say, this is quite a complex business. And so what I would suggest is that in preparing the application, particularly after you've sort of, perhaps as part of the reflective process, think about the different ways in which you would meet these criteria in relation to each of those 4 subcategories or aspects of teaching. And so draw up a bit of a plan of the sort of points you want to hit in your narrative as you go about developing it. And in that way, you'll kind of have a plan, but you'll be able to focus on explaining yourself and painting a picture of you as an educator that's going to be compelling, but also to all of these criteria that need to be covered. Clearly, there's quite a bit to cover. And so, as I say, it would be helpful, I think, to summarise just in your own mind what things you do want to include in your application. So a bit of a mud map over to the side on what needs to be in the application. And of course, in choosing the different forms of evidence against each of those criteria, remember that evidence is going to be compelling to the panels when it's consistent, when it fits together, so there's a level of coherence to it, it's aligned with the narrative, it comes from multiple sources, and ideally some of those sources may be independent, could be peers, could be other source forms of recognition, and of course we're asking you to address all of those 4 criteria. It needs to provide across the whole application an accurate view of you. And so I think you want to kind of get to the point where you have a narrative that has all of the information in it, but it's been bound together in a relatively coherent form. It's going to be easy for the panel to see that you've met each of the assessment criteria in each of the subcategories. I've put together a bit of what the panel looking for. A mix of quantitative and qualitative information often works well, and some of the quantitative information can be conveyed in a very succinct way in graph form, so do feel free to use graphs. You're probably going to need to play around with the application once you've worked out what you want to say and sort of how to get it in a form that you're happy with, but really, if you can kind of prepare the sort of touch points, the quantitative and qualitative touch points in advance, then I think that'll give you a great frame from which to then actually write the application. And of course, in relation to the quantitative and qualitative data, quantitative works really well when you want to explain the sort of overall impact of what you're doing. Data, for example, on student learning outcomes or student success is very compelling when it's for a whole cohort, but qualitative works really well when you want to illustrate the essence or character of what you do and how you do it, how you go about it. And students' own words and their experience of your teaching make a great difference at that point. And as I said before, the more you can get feedback from your colleagues, the more helpful that is. One thing we have noticed over a couple of years is that some applications forget or don't really go into any detail on what we call subcategory D, which is drawing on the scholarly literature. So I just remind you of that so that you can be sure to address all of the subcategories in your application. You probably think I've overused the term coherence in what I've said so far, but panels do spend quite a lot of time discussing that. They like to be satisfied that they have a picture of you in which the narrative matches up with the evidence that you've provided, because where people do have what they see as a clear view of you and the evidence you provide, they're much more confident in making a judgment about it. So that is important, and that is one of the things on which it's really helpful to get feedback from colleagues. I've also noted that many people are successful on a second attempt, so please don't be too disappointed if this is your first attempt and you're not successful. Over time, you gather more evidence and more experience, and inevitably one becomes a better teacher. Please do bear that in mind. But as I say, we hope this process is useful no matter what. Please remember that almost everyone who puts in an application for one of the awards is already an excellent teacher. that's not in doubt. And what the challenge really is in this case is to communicate your excellence in a way that meets all of the criteria, as I've explained. It's a genuinely challenging task that is really worth it, I hope, and which I think you and your teaching deserve to have every effort put into. I would say the resources on the AAUT website are excellent. I think the team's done a fabulous job at putting those together. It's very clear. And the last thing I wanted to sort of draw attention to is the fact that the process has been honed quite carefully through its own reflective feedback process over the years by that excellent small team that Ange mentioned right at the start. And my experience is that it's now yielding a very high consistency of judgment across assessors. That does, of course, make our work much easier. But I think, I hope, and I mention it today because I hope it gives you the confidence to put a lot of effort into your application, knowing that it will be read with pleasure, enjoyment, and a great deal of care, and it will result in a high level of consistency of judgment. That's it from me, but I did want to say good luck. And of course, when the moment is right, we will have an opportunity for questions. So thanks, Ange, back to you.
Thank you so much, Pip, and it's particularly highlighting the importance of coherence and making sure that their narrative is supported by the evidence that they provide. Really, really important. And this is a piece of work that the committee should be able to pick up and just sit back and really enjoy to reach a beautiful flow to it, and you get a real sense of the person and what they're doing and how they're really supporting that student learning and student engagement. And so the next two invitees that we have here are recipients of the Teaching Awards, and they're going to share a little bit of their experience. And I thought we would start with perhaps each of you. I gave the people that have joined us today a little bit of overview about yourselves, but maybe just tell us a little bit about what was it that you do in your teaching that made you go for an award. So maybe we'll start with Diana. Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks so much for having me, and also Angelina and team for your tremendous work. It's just fabulous, and thank you so much. Yeah, going for the award, I was tapped on the shoulder by the lovely people at Griffith to say, will you go for this? And of course I said yes, because that word's easy, it comes out of my mouth and anything else does. And I was really lucky and had lots of support for that as well. In particular for me, I always find these things are really useful as a good moment to sort of stop and really rigorously look at my teaching practice. And so that was the prime motivation to do this. And I'm really grateful for it because already from going through that process, because you always come out of it going, oh, I need to change everything and modify and blah, blah, blah. I've already initiated some initiatives that have sort of come out of that process, and they've come to fruition already this year just from doing that last year. So I'm eternally grateful for that. So that's a prime motivation for me, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Bonnie, what was your prime motivation?
Probably exactly the same, because I'm a little bit slower than everyone else. I've probably had more than 2 goes at applying for some of these awards, citations and teaching awards. I feel like I've had an exposure to that reflective journey that really has made me understand the power of it. And yes, the teaching award application is the mechanism for that, but I think you can get that in alternative ways. It just forces you to do it more, I suppose, and gives you a deadline and gives you that motivation to do it. And so I think the motivation from me was having that first little experience about, well, what did I learn about myself and my teaching and with the purpose behind it? And then I was kind of hooked from that point, because a bit like Diana, the more I reflected, the more I was like, well, okay, what does that actually mean for my students and for me enjoying this teaching and the purpose that I have in teaching? And is it actually fulfilling the purpose, or do I think it is? So it's really quite an introspective process once you start doing it to a fairly high quality. And that, to me, is the power of applying for a teaching award.
And that ties in very nicely to exactly what Pip said. First of all, is that you may not get the award the first time, so don't give up. Keep going, because every time you revisit and you reiterate, you are becoming clearer on your narrative and you're sourcing more evidence to support the direction you want to move in. So really ties in nicely with Pip's starting words as well. So I thought maybe now you could perhaps share your experience in preparing for a teaching award. So maybe, Bonnie, I'll start with you and then Diana. So how did you go about preparing for a teaching award?
Look, I really loved how Pip said prepare early. If you are going to do this, it's not worth doing a last minute job on this. It's actually, if you're going to get the benefit out of it, do it properly or don't do it at all. And I think it's important to know that you might have to have a number of goes at this, and persistence is important, and you'll get benefits from that persistence. But I think probably you don't realise how much persistence is required once you've done your first draft, because you think, I've done my first draft, that's it, I've ticked that box, I'll submit it and I'll move on. And it's not until you kind of finish that first draft until you're really starting the hard work at that point, because that's where, if you're really authentically engaged in this process, where the feedback process comes in. And we've been really lucky here at the University of Newcastle, but I know other universities are set up very similarly, that there are multiple ways of getting feedback. The AAUT has mentoring options. Internally, we had mentoring options. There's lots of past applications that you can look at or approach people to ask if they're willing to share them. So the real work starts after you've finished that horrible, really difficult first draft, and that's where the gold comes from, really from that point on, because that first stage is just getting stuff that's in your head and putting it on paper. And the refinement is the really beautiful stage, but also the really difficult stage. So for me, that's probably the first thing to be really blunt and honest about.
Process of iteration, getting feedback is really important. Perhaps having a mentor and perhaps looking at some past examples. Great. Diana, what was your experience in preparing for the Teaching Award?
Yeah, my first draft looked like a magpie and a Labrador got together and smashed an application. Like, it was just a shocker. I actually spent, even prior to that, I reckon a good 2 weeks worth of time just making broad spreadsheets and a real deep dive into data. I just mined everything. I just did SETs, SECs, comparative to Griffith, where I sat in the university, student pass-fail rates, surveys I'd conducted, longitudinal data of industry data, my PhD data, student emails, their employability, the quilt outcomes, grad outcome stats. I even went and asked questions of people who seemed enthusiastic to embrace my innovations and emailed them and said, hey, that thing I said in that conversation we had, did anything come out of that? And I was shocked to find out what they'd actually taken with them. Like, there was one person that just redesigned an entire curriculum in Holland, and I was like, oh, I had no idea. And it was all based on stuff. So if you don't ask those questions, you don't find out. And so that part of it was actually surprising and enjoyable. And then even just finding publication stats, all this stuff that I just never bothered to really worry about because I was just too focused on just, do the teaching. And Google was a good friend, and I found out some crazy stuff even through just Googling. It was just so bizarre. That, and then 26 drafts later, got to the final point where it was getting in front of the mentor. So I was really lucky. We have excellent support at Griffith. They're fantastic. And I also had a mentor who was very tolerant of my creative method of putting things together. Just think of more analogies here, but a traditional Greek dance, how it gets faster and faster towards the end. And so, and then it was vetted against an internal panel and signed off by our DVC, Learning and Teaching, and then it finally got to go out the door kind of thing. So it was a big, long process, but I learnt so much. It was just amazing.
Yeah, so you used a lot of qualitative data, comments from students, but also how others were adapting and using the work that you were doing, which I imagine would have a really strong influence on the committee in terms of who else has adopted this work, how is it changing teaching practice in your disciplines. So good to hear good messages from both of you. The next question's around challenges. Did you face any challenges in preparing for your submission, and how did you overcome these? Bonnie, we'll start again with you and then we'll go Diana.
Look, I think probably the challenge of time is just one that's going to be common to everyone. I feel like the challenges really happened in between my different applications. It's always difficult to get the feedback that's not what you want to hear. But gestating on that and actually really reflecting really deeply on that feedback was a challenge. But I think it's no different to when you submit a research paper and you get the feedback on the research paper. There's always that advice that you always get is read the feedback, put it aside, don't think about it for a week, then come back to it, and then engage with it slowly over time. And I think one of the things that I realized very early on was how much it was helpful. So a challenge is only a challenge if you don't reframe it as an opportunity, which is really easy to say, of course. I think the other challenge that I had was understanding the breadth of different types of evidence that was out there. And I really love how Diana started with the evidence. And if I had my time over again, that's what I would do. I started the opposite way around and then found out how the evidence would match my narrative. And I don't know whether one is right or wrong, but personally, I would feel more confidence building if I could see the evidence before me first and use that to give me confidence to then go in and say, well, what are the main themes? Because I think this sense of coherence and narrative that you're talking about has to also apply to the story that you're telling. And I still don't think I've done that very well, despite actually being successful in the ward. And I think my career, and I don't know about other people applying, my career was very bitsy. I had lots of sessional things in different areas. And so it was really hard to bring that narrative together because it wasn't as if I just had this one job and I was able to have this linear journey, or no one has a linear journey, so I'm not going to even say that, this somewhat cohesive opportunity, let's put it that way. So I struggled with that narrative, and I think my last application continued to do so. It's not until you see the evidence before you that you can start thinking about that narrative, and maybe taking a break and allowing that to subconsciously gestate might have been helpful. And that's where the time comes in. I think having more time is really helpful as well.
Thanks, Bonnie. Diana?
I think, well, I mean, the first one was, it's a pretty big award. It's very daunting. And so that in itself is intimidating enough. So I think I even wrote on a Post-it note on the computer, don't focus on the award, just focus on the process. And so I was just like, yeah, just stick that there and just keep looking at that. But still, in reading other people's exemplar applications, etc., there's some brilliant people out there and they've done some incredible stuff. And, you know, they clearly wear a cape to work every day. And it was not hard to get imposter syndrome and go, gee, why am I doing this? And I told myself, and I tell other people, look, this is a normal process. It's right up there with doing your PhD, I suppose, where you sort of think, oh, that's only for smart people, etc. But this is really normal, and your story is your story. So just tell it. Everyone has their own lived experience of what it is that they're doing within their distinct discipline. That was probably a big thing. I also had to just tell myself every day when I was sort of getting up and, you know, onto draft number 19, number 20, etc., etc. And so the other thing I found a perceived challenge more than maybe it actually was is just communicating the arts has historically been hard because we do a lot of stuff behind closed doors and what people see is the end result and not the process as well. So in my head, I had that we're the misunderstood artist, you know, kind of thing. So communicating that to a potentially non-arts panel, I was just really aware of that. So I was aware of writing without jargon, spelling out acronyms, even though I knew it was going to sort of take up space on the page, writing in really simple language because I'd seen other people's language and felt it was dense. And I just thought, well, I've peer assessed on grants before. I've peer assessed for AAUT as well. And my brain just doesn't work that way. I can't read dense language. Some people can and they just embrace it. My brain just switches off. So I was like, simple language. Do paragraphs, even again, it will sacrifice space, but have paragraphs, have your pictures, have your diagrams, have your tables, making sure that absolutely everything's relevant and spoken to. And in particular, like, because I chose the video option of the Teaching Award and I knew I would have to place myself in situ of the environment that I am teaching, music livelihoods and my own experience as well. So I put myself in the pit of West Side Story that I was working with the season at the time and, you know, literally had to wait till the audience left and the vacuum cleaner lady had gone away and so and had to, you know, just to do the one take before company management started screaming at me. And so I sat in the pit and sort of videoed myself and just to sort of show what it's like like, because the pit is dark. It's not as exciting on the stage, and there is a lot of hard work and it is noisy, etc. So I wanted to sort of communicate what it actually is like to be a musician as well. So they were perceived challenges, I guess, that I thought that perhaps I was up against. Whether that was real or not is another story.
Great. I'm going to invite Pip back on, because there's a question that I'm going to pose to three of you. What do you suggest as possible ways to show teaching is innovative and creative? So, and I know that you had to address that. That was one of the criteria.
Look, to be blunt, I didn't find this too hard, and it's not through any genius of my own. I am actually in a field which is quite on the edge of new knowledge anyway, and I'm just lucky to teach that. So what I found hard was evidencing that it was innovative, and it wasn't until right at the end of my application process that I happened to be jumping into the literature for a completely different purpose that was purely around building content, and I just stumbled across some academic articles which were actually talking about how there was a lack of adequate teaching in the space that I teach in. So I was partially lucky, but it's really, once again, coming back to this evidence thing, really having a diversity. I've done a bit of an audit of programs. That's only so much. So it's really about triangulating the data. So you can present your own perfect sort of like data, and my data was imperfect, and I had to acknowledge that. But because it was triangulated with something that had a little bit more authority internationally, that really helped. So it comes back to bringing the data in and knowing what other people are doing and what they're not doing. Actually evaluating if your teaching is innovative. Like some of my teaching I thought was innovative, and I discovered that it wasn't, that there'd been some parallel evolution and other people were doing that. I suppose that's the first stage. Is it innovative?
All right. Diana?
It's a bit like what Bonnie said. Is in my case, I was one of the firsts, if that basically sort of makes sense. So in 2011, I basically started this course and started implementing it, and then I started researching it, and the suite of courses that I was doing called My Life as a Musician and Vocation Preparation courses. And so up until then, it was more of a case you went to a conservatorium, you learnt your instrument or your craft, and then they spat you out the other end and said, good luck with that, hope all goes well with you. But these are vocation preparation courses that no one had sort of implemented before. So that in itself, I guess, being sort of a leader in that, and also, I guess, an early adopter of those concepts, was showing innovation in itself. And so like Bonnie was saying, all the evidence that basically sort of follows that. And then it's also like what you actually sort of have done with that as well. Have you researched it further? Have you kept upgrading your innovation as well, and basically still interested in it? Very surprised at myself, but after 40 years of being a musician full stop, and also a number of years of actually researching it, I still actually find musicians' lives and the curriculum design to support that actually still quite fascinating. So on one hand, show that what you're doing is a leader in its field in itself, but also on the other hand, show your enthusiasm for it too.
Pip, I just wanted to know if you had anything you'd like to add to that.
I remember clearly how impactful both applications were. So whatever you did it with a great deal of enthusiasm, and it was very compelling. So I was going to sort of point to three things, but I think you've covered them all. One is, to the extent that you know the literature, what is known and what's not known about effective teaching, it's very easy then to explain how what you're doing is different and why you've chosen to go in that direction, and what evidence you've got that it works. So that in itself is a great way of establishing innovation. But also, and I think Diana's example of this is very good, novelty of purpose. You were doing something that people in schools like yours weren't doing. So, and I think that really strikes a chord with, you're worrying about students' futures in a way that was novel. So it was a fantastic way of demonstrating innovation. And then thirdly, a lot of people achieve innovation by doing something that's very authentic and contextualized, and doing it in their own unique way. And that's a very creative sort of approach in its own right. So that also establishes innovation and creativity well.
Thank you, Pip. That was a really nice way to tie that all together. So fantastic. My next question is for the three of you. 3 tips for writing a successful Teaching Award application.
I think probably, again, being a peer assessor for grants, particularly in the artistic space, I was really conscious of avoiding reader cognitive dissonance. And so within that is just, you just don't want questions arising in the person's head. You don't want them to sort of stop and go, wait, what? Sort of really want to have a really good flow. So you're really well attuned to the language of your profession, your discipline, but others may not be. So on one hand, stay out of the weeds. Some of the details important to you, but it won't be to others. Conversely, you need to explain something or contextualize what's obvious to you, but it won't be to others. That would be one tip I have. I've heard this actually at previous AAUT meetings, PD meetings, but it's actually worth repeating. Don't start every sentence with the word I or my. The narcissism will get equally old for you as much as the reader, I believe. And a workaround is just offer context, which you can then discuss your contribution. So the I can be sort of put in the middle there, but keep the bigger picture, I think, going, because you're writing these things, I mean, you'd rather someone else write it for you. You don't want to write it yourself, so you're going to feel a bit funny by the time you've sort of finished the whole process. And then the other one, the last one I would say, is start every criteria that you're writing to with a sentence that sums up entirely what you want to say in that section, then unpack it. So the mentor I had a really good saying. He said, I want to know what I'm reading before I'm reading it. So that would be my 3 tips for the moment.
Yeah, great 3 tips. It's interesting. That's the way I always start my emails when I send out these global emails. The very first sentence should give the reader exactly what is there an action? Is it just for information? What is it? And then they can decide to read the rest of it or ignore it. Really important. Great tips. Bonnie, over to you. What are your 3 tips?
I think I've actually come up before anyway about clarity and not being more complicated than you need to be. In science, I'm not sure what it's like in some of the other categories. You could have someone reading that hasn't got your background. I know, and certainly in my field, there's lots of terminology. The advice that I got was to stay away from that and to write it in a very easy to read way. The same as what we tell our students when they've got written assessment tasks. We're going to be reading 80 of these. The clearest one is going to win. So yeah, just making it easy for the assessor, knowing that they've got a massive load to read through anyway. And then once again, the same thing we tell our students as well, just planning things. So that there is cohesion and flow between logic between all the different bits. I really struggled with that. I wasn't quite sure how to go about having the different parts of the application, the criteria, and how to connect them, given that I wanted to refer to things early in my career across both, and there was some disjunct between all the different bits in terms of a linear time flow. So maybe, Pip, you've got an amazing suggestion for that. And the other thing was the use of white space, because the 8 pages, you feel like you just need to cram in absolutely everything in there. But if you just have 8 pages of dense block text, it's really going to do a disservice to the content that you're delivering. So less will feel really awful, but maybe that's where you bring in someone else to tell you what to cut rather than you having to make that decision using the white space. And you can do that with paragraph breaks, of course, but also infographics or graphs or tables, anything that makes it easier and breaks it up for a reader so they've got the ability to just have a bit of just to enjoy the process of reading what you've got.
Thanks, Bonnie. And Pip, what are your 3 top tips?
Well, as usual, our great presenters, I think, have covered most of them, but let me have a go at just characterising them in my terms. And I think both have made a really clear point about being mindful of the audience. It's a group of people who are educators like you, but of course not necessarily in your discipline. And I think taking account of that and thinking about them as the audience is really helpful. And of course, that's where getting feedback from peers can be incredibly helpful, because especially if you're getting feedback from people who are not in your immediate field, they'll be able to tell you how effectively you've been able to do that and what you might be able to change to improve it. I love Diana's point on not being a narcissist. And I think that's where you can use the literature to advantage to talk about what we know works and what we don't know works, and what the sort of typical received wisdom on teaching practice is in a particular area, how you've gone about changing possibly or utilising it in a new way. And I think that's one way in which you can avoid that sort of I've done this and I've done that, but you actually situate your work in a much broader literature. And I was going to say something too about the broader planning. I think an easy to read application, you kind of get a sense early on what's coming. Your advisor, Diana, put it beautifully. You want to know what you read before you read it. I think you want to know what information is where and what your key points are, and then unpack them rather than have a sort of duel at the end, which people may not be in the mood to sort of receive in its best possible way if you don't reveal it until the end. So I think that really covers the sort of key points from my perspective.
Thank you, ladies, so much for engaging with participants today around planning and writing for a successful teaching award. Can I ask everyone to give Pip, Diana and Bonnie a virtual clap or a real clap? And I just wanted to say thank you so much for spending this time with potential award-winning teachers. Angela, I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Thanks, and just going to remind everyone of the nomination process and key dates. So do note that all applications are to go through your institution's contact offices. So by Friday, 26th of August, your ICO will register the nominees' details into the awards portals. And by Friday, 16th of September, your ICO is to submit all applications. That includes the submissions and photos online. So you still have a fair bit of time to get the applications in. After this, we have 2 more sessions to go in July. One is applying for a Never Born Awards for Indigenous Educations on 14th of July. We have another sessions on the 28th of July applying for an early career applications.
Thank you very much, everyone, particularly the presenters, and for all of you that have joined us. Please feel free to reach out to Angeline or Jin if you need any further information. A lot of the information is on the Universities of Australia website and the AAUTN network. If you need a mentor, please reach out and we'll try and organise that as well. Thank you. Have a lovely remaining afternoon, whatever's left in the afternoon, and a lovely Thursday night. Bye, everybody.
Good luck, everyone.